Tonight, we take you inside one of the most chilling chapters in American criminal history. Imagine living next door to a person whose actions were beyond comprehension, yet neighbors and authorities failed to stop him for years. This is the story of Jeffrey Dahmer, the Milwaukee man whose crimes shocked a nation and left an indelible mark on the city he called home. Jeffrey Dahmer was born in 1960, and over the course of more than a decade, he committed a series of murders that would earn him a place among history's most infamous serial killers. Between 1978 and 1991, he lured, attacked, and killed at least 17 young men, many of whom were people of color, and often in vulnerable situations. Dahmer's crimes were carried out largely in his apartment, where he attempted to conceal evidence using chemicals, refrigeration, and other methods that allowed him to operate undetected for years. His apartment in Milwaukee became a symbol of horror, a place where ordinary walls held unimaginable secrets. Neighbors reported foul odors and strange noises, some even noting unusual chemical smells, but early complaints were dismissed or misunderstood by law enforcement. In some cases, officers visited the apartment, yet Dahmer remained free. This gap in policing, coupled with social biases and assumptions, tragically allowed his crimes to continue unchecked. One of the most notorious incidents illustrating these failures involved a young victim, Konerak Sinthasomphone, a teenage boy who had been assaulted by Dahmer previously. On that day, witnesses found Konerak disoriented and frightened outside Dahmer's apartment and called the police. When officers arrived, they returned the boy to Dahmer, misjudging the situation due to assumptions influenced by race and sexual orientation. Within hours, Dahmer would end the boy's life, demonstrating the devastating consequences of systemic negligence. The officers involved were later terminated, but eventually reinstated, fueling ongoing debates about accountability and justice. Dahmer's methods were horrifying, yet there was also a meticulous and strange order to his actions. He attempted to preserve bodies with chemicals and kept some remains in refrigeration units. Sketches and photographs revealed his fascination with arranging bones, though there is no evidence that he followed any organized ritual. Beyond the crimes themselves, Dahmer maintained ordinary hobbies. He loved keeping fish and spent hours caring for his tanks, providing a strange and unsettling contrast to his violent acts. The investigation that ultimately led to Dahmer's arrest began with careful police work following a tip and a failed attempt to escape justice. In 1991, authorities discovered human remains in his apartment, finally bringing the horrors within to light. Subsequent investigation revealed not only the crimes, but also the extraordinary failures that had allowed Dahmer to evade capture for so long. In 1992, he was convicted and sentenced to 15 consecutive life terms, with an additional life sentence for a later murder. 2 years later, in 1994, Dahmer was killed by a fellow inmate in prison. The case remains deeply unsettling, not only because of the crimes themselves, but also due to the social and systemic factors that permitted them. Public reflection often turns to questions of race, sexuality, and policing. Many victims were young men of color, highlighting disparities in how law enforcement responds to cases depending on community and demographic factors. The Konerak Sinthasomphone case, in particular, continues to symbolize the human cost of bias and inaction, serving as a stark reminder that justice is not only about prosecuting criminals, but also about protecting the vulnerable. In the years since, Dahmer's story has continued to captivate the public imagination. Numerous documentaries, books, and dramatizations have explored his life and crimes. Recent portrayals focus not solely on the killer, but also on the victims and the failures that allowed him to continue, shedding light on a tragic and complex narrative that extends beyond the apartment walls in Milwaukee. These retellings often spark debate about the ethics of representing real-life horror, while also highlighting systemic issues in law enforcement and society. The apartment itself has become infamous, a place that remains etched in memory not for its physical structure, but for the acts it concealed. Neighbors recall the stench of decomposition and chemical treatments, yet early reports were often dismissed or misattributed. Dahmer would use various explanations to cover the smells, claiming dead fish or faulty refrigeration, manipulating perceptions to avoid scrutiny. These deceptions, combined with procedural gaps in police response, demonstrate how subtle social and institutional failures can have catastrophic consequences. Dahmer's personal life, too, presents a paradox. Interviews with his father Lionel Dahmer and post-arrest evaluations reveal a man who could exhibit ordinary interests and civility even as he perpetrated monstrous acts. This contrast raises questions about the nature of evil and how it can manifest in ways that seem ordinary to outsiders. It also fuels the public fascination with Dahmer, prompting discussions not only of the crimes themselves, but also of psychology, morality, and the factors that allow such behavior to go unchecked. Ethically, the case remains a touchstone for debates about justice, accountability, and media representation. Society grapples with how to discuss such crimes responsibly, balancing the need to remember victims and understand systemic failures against the risk of sensationalizing violence. Public reactions often reflect empathy for victims and outrage over failures, yet some also express discomfort with repeated dramatizations or focus on the perpetrator. Others argue that well-crafted narratives can provide insight into social issues such as bias, policing, and institutional negligence. The Dahmer case also provokes reflection on broader social responsibility. How do communities, law enforcement, and social structures intersect to either prevent or enable tragedy? In Milwaukee, repeated neighbor complaints were overlooked, and prior encounters with police failed to prevent further violence. These realities underscore the importance of vigilance, transparency, and accountability in public institutions, as well as the ethical obligation to protect those most at risk. While Dahmer's crimes ended with his arrest, the lessons extend far beyond his life and death. Families and communities were irrevocably impacted, law enforcement faced scrutiny, and society at large was forced to confront the uncomfortable truths about human behavior and systemic shortcomings. The continued interest in Dahmer's story reflects both horror and fascination, but it also serves as a case study in vigilance, accountability, and the consequences of neglect. Tonight, as we reflect on this story, it is impossible to ignore the human dimension behind the headlines. The victims were real people, with families, hopes, and lives cut tragically short. Their stories, along with the failures that allowed their suffering, remain central to understanding the case. As media and dramatizations revisit these events, the focus on ethical storytelling and societal learning becomes essential. It is not enough to recount crimes. The narrative must also honor the victims and question the structures that failed them. As we close this report, consider the broader questions raised by the Dahmer case. How can society better protect vulnerable populations? How do bias and negligence intersect to allow crimes to persist? And how should we responsibly tell these stories, balancing public interest with ethical responsibility? Jeffrey Dahmer's crimes remain a stark reminder of the consequences of both individual pathology and systemic failure. What do you think about this case? Share your thoughts below and don't forget to like and subscribe so we can uncover more stories together. This content is compiled and analyzed based on publicly available information and open discussions.